For decades, the world has celebrated the Beatles as the greatest band in history. But behind the music was a story far more complicated. Paul McCartney and George Harrison were more than bandmates. They were friends, brothers, and sometimes rivals. Their bond carried moments of loyalty, but also years of silence and conflict. And when George's life was cut short, Paul was left with memories of both harmony and regret. Today, the truth of that relationship finally comes into focus. Early bonds forged in Liverpool. Paul McCartney and George Harrison's friendship began long before Beatlemania consumed the world. Their first connection came in 1954, when both boys attended the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was a year ahead of George and already carving out a reputation for himself as bright, witty, and musically inclined. George, on the other hand, was younger, quieter, and often described as a boy trying to find his place in a rigid school environment that he loathed. They didn't bond over academics. George admitted years later that the Institute was the worst time of my life. Instead, their friendship blossomed on long bus rides into town, where the strict rules of school uniforms and class divisions melted away. On those bus journeys, George noticed Paul carrying his guitar, and conversation soon shifted from schoolwork to music. Both were fascinated by the rising skiffle craze sweeping Britain at the time, a rough homemade style that made young people believe they could form bands of their own. They shared admiration for American stars like Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Buddy Holly. George, in particular, was captivated by the raw sound of Heartbreak Hotel when he first heard it drifting out of a house in Liverpool. He spent hours at home sketching guitars in his school notebooks and practicing simple chords until his fingertips were raw. Paul, whose father, Jim McCartney, had been a jazz band leader in the 1920s, grew up surrounded by music, learning piano and then guitar. He quickly recognized George's dedication, and while their age difference might have seemed like a barrier, music erased it. By 1956, George had formed a small skiffle group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a friend, showing his determination to make music more than a hobby. By 1957, Paul had joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, and when the group began looking for another guitarist, Paul immediately thought of George. Lennon, however, was skeptical, feeling that George was too young and baby-faced. The turning point came one evening on the top deck of a Liverpool bus. George auditioned for John by playing a note-perfect version of Bill Justice's rockabilly instrumental Ranchi. Lennon couldn't argue with that level of skill, and George was invited into the group. With George on board, the nucleus of the Beatles was complete. The trio of Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison began spending countless hours together, teaching one another new chords, writing fragments of songs, and daring to imagine a future beyond the streets of Liverpool. For Paul, who had already lost his mother to cancer at age 14, the friendship offered both companionship and purpose. For George, it was the validation he craved, that he belonged among older, more experienced players. This period cemented Paul's role as George's early mentor and champion, but also set the stage for a relationship that, while rooted in brotherhood, would later struggle under the pressure of ambition, egos, and fame, success, and silent cracks. As the Beatles rose from Liverpool clubs to global stardom in the early 1960s, the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison grew more complicated. By 1966, the group was no longer just a band of friends experimenting with music. It was the most famous act in the world, and with that fame came pressure. Paul had gradually stepped into the role of the band's driving creative force. He thrived in the studio, pushing for innovation, orchestrating arrangements, and demanding perfection. For George, however, this growing dominance was suffocating. The difference was clear in the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. The project was largely Paul's vision, a record that would redefine rock music. But for George, it highlighted how little space was left for his ideas. His one contribution, Within You, Without You, reflected his immersion in Indian philosophy and spiritual music, but it stood apart from the rest of the album. To Paul, it was another track in a concept album. To George, it was deeply personal. Their contrasting priorities came to the surface during the Beatles' trip to India in 1968. George saw meditation and spirituality as life-changing, while Paul treated it as a diversion from the music. Paul later recalled joking with George, "Calm down, Georgie boy. Sense of humor needed here." But to Harrison, this was no laughing matter for him. The Beatles' obsession with records and business was distracting from the spiritual path he believed was essential. This clash of priorities set the tone for what followed. As Paul grew more determined to lead the group's direction, George became increasingly frustrated at being sidelined. For years, his songs were seen as secondary to the Lennon-McCartney catalog. But by the end of the decade, George was no longer content with being in the shadows, and Paul's inability to recognize that would come at a cost. Creative tensions and George's break. By 1969, the Beatles were no longer the tight-knit band of brothers they had once been. Recording sessions for Let It Be revealed just how strained things had become. Cameras captured the tension, with Paul McCartney frequently directing the others, often to the irritation of George Harrison. At one point, George snapped back at Paul's instructions. "I'll play whatever you wanted to play," or "I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was a moment that exposed years of frustration. George had grown into a confident songwriter, but Paul's controlling approach left little room for him to breathe. Harrison had quietly amassed a catalog of material. Songs like All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill. Yet many of them were pushed aside during Beatles sessions. Paul, alongside John, continued to dominate the releases, while George's compositions often remained unheard. On January 10th, 1969, George finally had enough. In the middle of rehearsals, he walked out, later recalling that it was very unhealthy and unhappy for him to stay. While John Lennon had spoken of quitting before, George's departure sent shockwaves through the group. The others scrambled to bring him back, realizing how essential he was, not only as a guitarist, but as part of the fragile balance that held the Beatles together. George did return 12 days later, but the cracks were permanent. His song Va Voir, written on the very day he quit, reflected his feelings about the suffocating environment Paul had helped create. Later that year, in a private conversation captured by writer Anthony Fawcett, Paul admitted to John that until now, "Our songs have been better than George's. Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." George dismissed this as a myth, insisting he had been writing those songs for years. The resentment was clear. Paul saw George as a late bloomer, while George saw Paul as someone unwilling to share space. It was during this period that George's frustrations hardened into music. On his landmark solo album, All Things Must Pass in 1970, the track Run of the Mill contained lines directed at Paul. "You got me wondering how I lost your friendship." The friendship was wounded, and though they would remain bound by history, the scars of 1969 would never fully heal. Abbey Road and Aftermath. Although the atmosphere in the band was toxic, 1969 also brought George Harrison his long overdue recognition. When the Beatles recorded Abbey Road, it was Harrison who delivered two of the standout tracks, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Frank Sinatra would later call Something the greatest love song ever written, while John Lennon himself admitted it was the best track on the album. For George, this was vindication after years of being overlooked. For Paul, however, it was a reminder that the balance of power in the Beatles was shifting. Behind the scenes, tensions remained high. George resented Paul's constant interference with arrangements. While Paul often believed George lacked the discipline to refine his ideas, their relationship during the Abbey Road sessions was professional, but far from warm. The music spoke louder than their conversations, and by the time the album was released in September 1969, the Beatles were already unraveling. The breakup became official the following year. George quickly moved forward with his solo career, releasing All Things Must Pass in late 1970, a triple album that stunned the world with its depth and maturity. Meanwhile, Paul released McCartney, marking the start of his journey as a solo artist, and eventually with Wings. The rivalry lingered, each man carving his own path, each proving he could succeed without the Beatles. Their interactions in the 1970s were sporadic and sometimes cold. In interviews, George openly admitted he found Paul overpowering, and once remarked that he would happily play in a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. For his part, Paul seemed to shrug it off publicly, but privately the sting of those words lingered. Despite the tension, there were moments of reconciliation. In 1971, George invited Paul to perform at the concert for Bangladesh, but Paul declined, citing concerns about the logistics. The absence widened the rift. As the years rolled on, the relationship between the two men seemed defined less by friendship and more by unresolved grievances, with George focusing on spirituality and solo projects, while Paul pursued relentless commercial success. Yet no matter how fractured things appeared, there remained an invisible thread between them, a shared history that neither could escape, even in bitterness. That thread would pull them together again decades later, though not without disagreements of its own. The Thrills' reunion and final years. By the early 1990s, time had softened some of the anger and circumstance brought Paul McCartney and George Harrison back together. On February 11, 1994, George, Paul, and Ringo reunited at McCartney's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. The press called them the Thrills, and for fans, it felt like a resurrection of something thought lost forever. But beneath the excitement, the old dynamics resurfaced. George arrived at the sessions with firm opinions. He insisted that his friend Jeff Lynne produce the tracks, warning Paul that without an outside hand, the project could dissolve into chaos. Paul later admitted it was George who said, "No, we need a producer. It could be dangerous just to all get in the studio. Could get nasty. You've got egos fly around." Even then, George's words carried the weight of their shared history. The collaboration produced songs like Free as a Bird and Real Love, but even in that process, George and Paul clashed. McCartney wanted the songs to sound quintessentially Beatles, while Harrison leaned toward simplicity and his own melodic instincts. They disagreed on solos, lyrics, even the spirit of what the reunion should be. Yet somehow the work got done, and the songs became a bridge back to their past. Outside the studio, their personal bond was fragile but enduring. George rarely masked his feelings. He once admitted he couldn't imagine being in another band with Paul, describing him as overpowering. Paul, meanwhile, began to publicly acknowledge what he had failed to see in the 1960s, George's genius as a songwriter. In interviews, he admitted he underestimated his younger bandmate, calling him a late bloomer, who ultimately wrote some of the greatest songs ever. As the decade closed, George's health began to falter. A throat cancer diagnosis in 1997, followed by treatment for lung cancer and later a brain tumor, forced him into a quieter life.